Hello, and welcome to Jung in the World. I'm Patricia Martin, and I'll be your host. Philosopher Lori Paul wrote an important book in 2014 entitled Transformative Experience that has captured the attention of scholars, thought leaders, and the media. In it, she examines what it means to make big, life-changing decisions when we have no frame of reference, no personal experience from which to draw. Her ideas help reframe how we should understand the transformative choices we make. Lori Paul is the Millstone Family Professor of Philosophy and the Professor of Cognitive Science at Yale University. A Guggenheim Fellow, she is most famous for her research on the concept of transformative experiences. She also explores questions of how the brain constructs the self, metaphysics, and decision-making. Hello, Lori Paul, and welcome to Jung in the World.
Hello.
So I was reading your book, Transformative Experience, and I was struck by how you define big life decisions that are transformative. You have a very specific way of defining that. Let's start there.
Okay. So I define a transformative experience as having two parts. And I'll just say, it's partly because I think these different elements are really important for understanding transformative experience, but also it's a philosophical concept. And as a philosophical concept, it's related to maybe what ordinary language would kind of characterize as transformative experience, but it's not quite the same. So I define a transformative experience as an experience that is both epistemically and personally transformative, where epistemically means that it changes something that you can know or how you know or what you know. And for me, it's really important that that way of knowing requires a certain kind of experience. So without having had an experience of the phenomenon, you couldn't know what it was like in a certain way. You have an epistemic transformation when you basically come into contact with that experience, like you see red for the first time, or those are some of the examples I like, where you taste a fruit for the first time, like a durian or some other kind of fruit you've never had, and then you discover something, and you couldn't have known what that taste was like or what red looked like until you actually had the experience of like tasting the fruit or seeing the color. And that epistemic transformation could be small in the examples I give, or it could be quite substantial, where it really changes the way you make sense of the world or the way you understand the world, as opposed to just changes like which color you think is the prettiest or what your favorite fruit might taste like. A personal transformation, a personally transformative experience, is an experience that changes some of your core personal preferences, like what you care about most, or who you take yourself to be, or what you value in some way. And I think that an experience is transformative in my sense when it is both epistemically and personally transformative. You make a discovery, you have a kind of experience that you couldn't understand in the relevant way without that experience, and it changes you personally in this fundamental and deep way.
You know, I just had this memory of talking with a group of librarians once about I asked them, how do you know your work is profound? Because they were talking about reading and books, and I could tell that they were deeply invested in this as an identity. And so I asked, how do you know it's profound? And they said, because when we ask people, can you remember the day that you could read something for the first time? And they say, to a person, people say, yes, because it changed everything. That would qualify, wouldn't it?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. So I know you use examples like what it's like to be a vampire, but I really had trouble going there because it's a scary idea, right? For one thing, let's be honest. But I appreciate the fact that you were really trying to put people way outside their scope of current understanding. And I think that's where your aim is true when you say, there is no real way to prepare yourself for this. And I think the other example you give is, should we have a child or not?
Yeah, that's one of them. I also am very interested in cases where someone, say, has an accident and experiences physical disability, or well, there's lots of when you get divorced, or um, people getting an education. So that's a bit like it. That's a different, going away to college. It's also, I think, transformative for people, like learning how to read. But yeah, one of my favorite real life examples. So I used the example of becoming a vampire, and I basically asked, like, imagine that if you had the opportunity to become a vampire, would you do it? But where the key is, well, you can't know what it's like until you actually become one, and it's an irreversible choice. Like, and it seems like it might be pretty cool to some people anyway. It might be very appealing, immortality, looking good in black. But but if you don't know what life is going to be like after that fundamental change, then how are you supposed to make a decision about it, at least in a rational way? I think having a baby is really like that. I mean, people can tell you what it's like. You can see other people have them. You can babysit, but there's just something really fundamentally different about, actually having the responsibility, the long-term fundamental responsibility of caring for this tiny person who depends on you utterly. That changes the way, at least changed for me, the way that I saw myself in various ways, what I cared about, and kind of experiencing that kind of loving attachment was really, it was a new kind of falling in love.
Yeah, it can't be perceived. It has to be experienced.
That's right. It's like, just like the first time you fall in love, like everyone can tell you, oh, what's this love thing, or it's, maybe, and it's supposed to be great. Like, a lot about it, but until you actually experience it. Like someone who's never been in love, like, and they tell you, oh, I know what it's all about. Like, you would be like, yeah, sure you do. It's the same kind of thing.
Right. I mean, that sheds a little light, doesn't it, on some of the current political debates going on. You argue, though, I think I have this right, that what we think of as having subjective value, such as, let's say, you're trying to imagine having a child for the first time. You seem to advocate for welcoming the opportunity to discover what it might be like. Like, that's the higher ground of your decision making. Why is that sense of discovery so valuable to the human experience?
Okay, so there's two things in there. So first, I'm not actually arguing for the value of discovery as just something in and of itself. What I argue is that when you're faced with a kind of rational problem, like how do you rationally choose to have a child? How do you rationally choose to become a vampire, where you can't actually know the nature of the experience until you undergo it, and it's going to change you anyway. So you're making this life-changing choice without, in a really fundamental way, knowing what you're getting into. And then also it's making you into someone new. There just isn't a simple answer to whether or not you should choose to do it if you're at all ambivalent. Like, if you're not sure, well, you haven't got what you need to make any kind of rational choice. And also it's going to change you anyway. So, like, what are you choosing? So I argue that, well, there is a way out, and that is if you reframe the decision problem and say, well, actually, I value discovery. I want to discover, like, what it's like to be a parent, or what it's like to be a vampire, and I would choose on that basis. Or I don't want to discover something. Like, I don't want to discover what it's like to have a physical accident, so I'll choose on that basis, even though I don't actually know what I'm choosing. And even though people who have, like, catastrophic physical accidents will say, well, the person that I've become is someone who I want to be, and I would never change a thing. Like, all of that is consistent, and I'm fascinated by the consistency of this kind of seeming inconsistency. Now, it doesn't mean that I don't value discovery. I actually really love the value of discovery and what I describe as revelation, because I think there is an independent sense in which discovery of the new has a value. But that's a different part of the picture. I guess I think there's this wonderful kind of side effect of undergoing transformation, where we learn something new, and that this has independent value, and can kind of create a sense of meaningfulness that goes along with trying to make the decision rationally. So, maybe I decide to become a parent, even though I know there's something really, the essence of parenting just isn't something I could know about until I actually make the commitment. And that can be hard because it's not obviously a win-win. Like I can't, I'm making career choices by becoming a parent. I'm making other kinds of social choices by becoming a parent. But I do it anyway. And then I discover something. I discover like the nature of this new loving relationship, which is pretty beautiful. And I discover the joy of having a child. I also discover the utter suffering and and pain that comes along with having a sick child or being exhausted all the time and all of these other things. So, but I think that's also actually quite interesting in a kind of intellectual way.
So writers often do this, where you stand back before you really start refining a text. You stand back and you say, okay, what's the metaphor? What's the big operating metaphor here? So I wonder if you do that as a philosopher. In other words, did you say to yourself, what is the big operating metaphor? Is life a quest? Is life an experiment? Was there a way in which you approached all of this, the development of this very sophisticated but very useful set of arguments that you first had to begin with what the essence of life is?
I didn't approach things like life as a quest or life as a narrative or anything like that. I mean, I might have had some of those tropes. I mean, I'm an American where, this is like the American way in some sense to think of choose your own adventure or whatever. It was actually more of that, just kind of, approaching life with a sense of deep puzzlement and trying to figure out what's going on, like really since I was in middle school, to be honest, like thinking about how to make sense of the world and myself in it, and trying to understand, what truth was and what was meaningful, and how to approach and how to try to make rational sense of the world. Like, maybe not in a super sophisticated way as a middle schooler, but that was actually just definitely the question. And so that was the quest. And as I trained to become a philosopher, I felt like I was gaining tools there that would allow me to ask this question and make the kinds of arguments that I'm making in a more precise way, and a way and that's valuable. It's valuable because I think one can be clearer, but it's especially valuable because it allows people to argue with you or ask you questions or misunderstand you in a precise way so that you can then respond to that. So precision is really important to me, like having a formal way of asking and representing these questions and then pursuing their answers has value, I would say.
I think it's interesting that you were, even as a child, aware that you had big questions on your mind. Did you know? Does
that was a weird thing to do? No, a weird kid.
So now I'm wondering, okay, how does that middle school girl find her way into, I need to be a philosopher?
Wow, that's a very good question. So that's interesting. So I don't have a good answer for that. I have to tell you that I spent from middle school on puzzling about these things and thinking about these things. And then I went to college, and I really always really liked also scientific questions. And my parents encouraged me to become a doctor. And, like good parents do, they're thinking, oh yeah, go to medical school. That's a very solid, yeah, exactly. And so I enjoyed chemistry, in particular organic chemistry. I enjoyed problem solving, but I was taking these classes in various sciences and thinking, but I really feel like something's missing here. I'm not addressing the questions that I've always wanted to address and I've been thinking about in this kind of confused way. So I took a philosophy class, and just it was terrible. Like I couldn't even stay for like 3 weeks. I sort of failed out, and so then I didn't, because I was thinking, well, maybe I'll take some more philosophy classes, and that'll, somehow I realized that philosophy was about asking questions. Like that's about as far as I got. And anyway, didn't get very far. I think the TA found me really intensely annoying. And so I didn't take any philosophy classes. I ended up majoring with a double major in chemistry and biology. And then I started applying to medical schools, and I got interviews at med schools, and I got accepted at a couple places. But as I was like some places didn't have interviews, but as I was interviewing, actually went to Harvard to interview. And the procedure back in the day was that, as I remember it, you met with a current medical student who kind of took you around the campus, and then you had to go over to the med school and get interviewed by like a couple of doctors. And something a little bit the same happened at Johns Hopkins, which was another place I had an interview. There you were with like this group of prospective medical students. And as I started doing all that, I realized I was a total fish out of water. Like that these people were great. They were very smart and everything, but like I just didn't have much in common with them. Like the way I wanted to think about the world was not fitting with the very kind of, I guess, practical mindset of the people I was interviewing with, nor the people who were interviewing me. And as I wandered around the main campus at Harvard, I thought, oh, I think I really just I'd love to be here, but I'd love to be here to study philosophy. So I dropped out of the procedure. I dropped out of the admissions process, withdrew, and much to the utter dismay of my parents, went off and found this like master's program that would take someone with no background in philosophy, and studied some philosophy and decided I was going to go to grad school in philosophy, which is like completely, I had no basis for this other than my very like strongly held view that I just really needed to do it. And I mean, I had nosed around bookshops I would go to bookshops, I would go to the philosophy section and nose around the books and read bits of them and not understand them at all, but find them kind of fascinating. So that was basically the ground for my approach.
So I admire your wherewithal, just even as an undergrad moving into potentially medical school, that you could say, hey, I don't belong here. And it leads me to a question that I had as I was reading your book that, okay, aren't all decisions that we make that are life-changing, that are forks in the road, they will define us now, these decisions, really, don't they all boil down to who we want to be and who we want to become? That's what we're really choosing.
Absolutely. Well, yes, but what I'm fascinated by is they absolutely do. And of course, I was making these decisions about like, okay, this is what I want to do. But I mean, okay, and it's just the more if I talk about this, you ask this line of questioning, it becomes apparent that yes, a lot of my work is like, oh, I figured this out about my confused way of being in the world. So I do think that fundamentally we make these choices. Oh, this is what I want to be. I want to become a parent. I want to become, I don't know, a doctor. I want to become a pianist. I want to become a professor. And we haven't, in the essential sense, got the slightest idea what we're getting ourselves into. Okay. There's a sense in which we do. We can have testimony from other people. You can see the way that other people live their lives. So you know stuff about it. But in this other really kind of essential way, like what is it going to be for you to live your life this way? How will you think about the world? How will you experience the world and the ideas that you're going to discover? And how will you change in response to the particulars of making this life choice that we don't know? And in a certain way, that matters most to us. And fundamentally, we can't know it. And so we make the choice based on the testimony and evidence that we have, which is like all we've got, but woefully inadequate along the dimension that matters most. The beauty of it all is that we remake ourselves in various ways, and it often works out. But we can talk about that.
Well, yes. I mean, I think that this is valuable, especially because I think people are now having to make so many life-changing decisions more often with, we have a lot of information, but not necessarily a lot more guidance. And so I think that your thesis kind of lets people off the hook. In other words, you can't know all this. I mean, so we have a fear. We have a fear of being wrong. Oh my gosh! If I make this decision and I'm wrong, it takes me back to Kierkegaard's prediction that making big life choices in the modern world, the modern person would endlessly prepare without ever taking a leap.
So I do think, first of all, there is an incredible fear that we might be wrong, that we might make a mistake. I see a lot of differences in people in terms of this. Like, I think some people are much more willing to take chances and be wrong. And then others are like, no, we can know everything we need to know as long as we do enough research. And I think that often, I'm a pretty like pro-science person, but I think that just kind of reflects a certain kind of desire to make the world simpler than it actually is. And sometimes also people who have not experienced a lot of upheaval in their world think that they know more than they do. Or like there are some people where the world is like sort of carved out for them. Like, let's say you're like super wealthy and everything has been like set up for you in a very nice way. You're not really taking a lot of chances when you do stuff. In most cases, most of your decisions, you'll probably be fine. But somebody who doesn't have that kind of security blanket, they have to take a bigger chance when they act. And I think it becomes easier to see how risky these actions are when the consequences of making a mistake become more apparent.
So when you're talking about people making decisions, big decisions, without a ton of knowledge because it's unknowable, this is what you mean by radical ignorance, correct?
Yeah.
What's the biggest decision you've ever made in radical ignorance?
I don't know if there's a biggest one. I've made several. Having a kid, choosing to become a philosopher, getting married, getting divorced. When I was little, I'm sure I made choices that I can't recall. So I would say those were some of the big ones. They're these like kind of classic life transitions. That's what's so fascinating. They're like these ordinary features of life turn out to be transformative in ways that you wouldn't think they would be, because the ordinary, like the kind of garden variety conception of like a transformative experience makes it sound like you're having like a religious revelation or something like that. And oh, by the way, and religious change can also certainly be transformative and would be a species of what I'm talking about. I'm just not discussing that at the moment. But it's actually like these mundane things that most of us go through. We get an education, we decide to have a child, decide to get married, whatever. These things that on the face of it, everyone undergoes and that we should all kind of have a really, really solid grip on, are the things that I think turn out to be transformative. And it's kind of amazing.
Yeah, because we don't give them that credence.
And you think, well, everyone knows about it because everyone does it.
Right. It's banal, right?
I just want to say another way where this happened was the pandemic. Like the way that when it first started, like you were getting these reports and everyone thought like, okay, we're going to have to stay inside for 2 weeks. Like, it's like that. Like we had no idea what was coming down the pike. And you might have hoped we would learn. I don't know if we have, but like, it's a good example of like, you think you're just doing something that was not the same as like, was not an ordinary thing. On the other hand, it was like clear we had no idea what was in store. And until we were in the middle of it, we weren't able to kind of even prepare properly because we had no idea. And you would think we would have. You would think, there's plenty of evidence about like pandemics and medical science is so advanced. You would think if there was any place we would have been able to know what was happening, it would have been there, and we failed. And I don't think it was just about politics. I actually think it's something about like human psychology that played a role there.
Say more about that. What part of human psychology kind of let us down, as it were?
Well, because you can't know you can't know. First of all, we thought we knew all about disease, but it turns out just like when we make like new kinds of discoveries, like in artificial intelligence or in science generally, there was something that we hadn't been prepared for. So we thought we knew all about like coronaviruses actually, and in fact, it turns out there's so little that we knew. Just finally discovering that, it's about like airborne transmission. That was a huge deal. Remember, everyone was like sanitizing, like they were wiping down their groceries or whatever, because we thought like we were going to communicate through touching something. Like, so like what you don't know what you don't know. And we don't make these discoveries until we discover, oh, now we know we don't know something or whatever. I mean, this is just a kind of very common, ordinary garden variety psychological fact. And so it's very hard for us to attach the right level of importance to things that we don't know that we don't know. And so and we were unable to kind of project forward and into the future. Like if we could have time traveled into the future, maybe we could have, prepared a little bit better. If we could come back and like prepare a little bit better for that after the pandemic. But without that kind of foresight, it doesn't surprise me at all that we had such trouble managing and handling the pandemic. I mean, I'm not saying there weren't political issues as well, but I don't think that was actually the root of it.
But it's also interesting to me then, we are kind of in an amnesiac place about the pandemic. I mean, we just in the daily parlances, talking to people, it's like 2 years of life just dropped away and we skipped over and now we're back. And we understand tacitly that it's different, but we're not saying, God, it's not like the war where we're saying, well, back in the war, we're not talking about it. We're not right. Our lives had no, there were no touch points, maybe is what I'm sensing, that would give our lives meaning. So we just don't talk about it.
Well, I mean, that last bit I'm not sure about, but let me just say I had 2 kids. It was painful the first time I had a child. And about a year after that pain receded, I was ready to have another child. And it's an awful lot like the pandemic. So I'm just saying, like, the pain seems to recede. You don't remember quite how bad it was. Like there's a kind of amnesia quality to the whole thing. And I think there's a similarity there, basically.
So you travel the world and you talk about these, making decisions that are transformative. And you also talk about what it's like to make decisions in transformative times. And I want to get to that in a second. But for right now, I'm just curious. Do people ever, kind of line up and pull you aside and say, by the way, I have a big decision to make? Do you ever attract people like that?
Well, yes. The trouble is that if they've heard me speak, they know I'm better at asking questions than answering them. And I was doing the work. I mean, I can answer questions that you put to me, but my work is about raising philosophical puzzles. I don't have a whole lot of solutions for these puzzles. I mean, I'm not sure that I think there are solutions. I don't think it's a bit like, sometimes people ask philosophers like, well, why aren't you answering these questions? Or, what's the point of doing philosophy? I just get confused after a while. And that's because, philosophy isn't like science in the way that, scientific questions are made to be answered. And if we can get a definitive answer, so much the better. But philosophy is about wisdom. It's about, seeing different ways to think about things and uncovering questions that we hadn't recognized before. And so if someone says, I have a big decision to make, or how do I resolve that? I don't really have anything new to say to them, aside from the point that I made earlier, that there's a way to resolve the rational puzzle by changing what we value rather than knowing exactly what we're doing for some particular option. We value discovering what doing that is going to be like. But it's like a version of like, just sit back and don't worry. I don't mean that, but that's not especially helpful. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Just follow your bliss.
Yeah, exactly. Like that's not, yeah, exactly. So, but I can certainly, give them more things to worry about if that's what they want.
So that leads me to the question of transformative time. So, I mean, it's more and more evidence is stacking up that we are really entering transition for world culture. I think how we understand our interrelatedness, how we understand our relationship to the land and the elements and each other. What do you have to say about decision making in transformative times? Do you have a greatest hits on that?
Well, okay, so I think, some of the places where we face this have to do with climate change, as you alluded to, and I'm, thinking quite a bit about um, how we think about the nature of intelligence, and in particular machine intelligence, and the scientific discoveries and changes that all of that basically are coming constantly now. There's a constant stream of them on the science of the mind. And I think in these contexts, there's some work. John Quiggin is an economist in Australia, and he would argue for, and others have argued also, that you should follow a precautionary principle when you're faced with something that could have enormous negative impacts. And when it's hard, climate change is actually a little easier to grapple with than this kind of scientific change, because with climate change, I think a lot of people think, well, there'd be so many negative things by pursuing various kinds of unfriendly environmental policies, that we shouldn't do it. And then it's kind of the oil companies and, various people who stand to gain lots of money who think, well, there'd be all these positive things, but the distribution of positive benefits, to the extent that making money is positive, obviously that's great, but not the only thing that matters. But the distribution of the positive and is not correlated to the distribution of the negative. I mean, the people who would be making all this money are not the ones, the people that would be receiving all the negative benefits of climate change are not necessarily the ones that would be making the money. They'd be future generations. Whereas when we think about the advancement of science, it seems like, at least, and certainly people working in artificial intelligence will argue, that there will be so many advances that we'll make and so many discoveries that will create positive things for humankind, that we should do it. And it's only recently that people have then been wondering, well, actually, there are a lot of negative possibilities as well. And shouldn't we be so sure that these scientific advances will be positive? I mean, maybe there'll be lots of negative stuff, and how do we balance that? And so it depends on the balance of positive and negative, and even trying to identify that, whether or not you should follow a heuristic that's precautionary, namely, in some sense, do as little bad as you can, act with precaution, or exploratory, go for it and see what happens, and take chances because there could be so many benefits. Like, these are different ways you could approach a situation. And I think there's a further complication, which is we don't even know. I mean, my own theory is that some of the outcomes that we would be considering are in principle unknowable until we are embedded in them. And I think that's a problem. I don't really know what to say about it, other than it's not obviously right by any stretch of the imagination that we should just do it and see how things play out, because the revelation that we're talking about, the impact of such revelation could be quite negative. Right? It's one thing if it's just you and it's about the nature of your life, and you make some interesting discoveries about what it's like to be a parent, or what it's like to be a sociologist, or whatever. Pick your favorite job. It's another thing if we do something that results in massive climate change, and there's a kind of revelation, because revelation isn't necessarily positive. It's about discovering something bad or good. And we discover life in a climatically transformed world is miserable. It's not clear to me that there's anything that justifies allowing that transformation to happen.
So transformations, which transformations we allow and which transformations we gatekeep for in our own lives, going back to the individual. So Carl Jung would say that the self already knows what it wants. The self already, it's a seed, and it's going to follow the DNA that it is encoded with, as it were. And so I also wonder about that in relation to transformative experiences, meaning when we choose not to do something that could be transformative and might have benefited us, does it come back around, and do we or have we put ourselves on a completely different path and now we have to walk all the way around the woods to get back on the path where the self really wanted us to go?
Okay, so I guess I'm sorry to say this, but I don't agree with Jung on this. I think that what happens is, I'm happy to say that there's a self that has its kind of DNA and how it wants to evolve. But I think when we make a choice of the sort that I'm talking about, we replace ourselves in various ways. So I don't think there's like kind of one self that's always trying to kind of get back to what it is. It's rather that we make a choice. And if this choice is transformative, we replace the self that we were with a new self. And then there might be some DNA like for that self to evolve, but that it's not like there's any kind of preordained kind of path to take. That's, again, the randomness of some of this that I'm fascinated by.
So we're very iterative. This is fascinating to me in that what I'm getting my mind around is just how mutable we are as a species.
Well, I do think it's not that I think we could change everything. So maybe the Jungian hypothesis is we have some fundamental kinds of dispositions that are kind of encoded into us physically. That seems plausible to me. So there might be some kind of general ways that we are that are immutable for us as long as we're persisting. But then there are other things that can change. So I said there's a kind of mutability and then maybe a kind of constancy. And it's that interaction that's really interesting.
So I'm very curious what you're working on now, because this book, Transformative Experiences, has been out for a while and you're still talking about, well, you're talking to us today.
Yes. People they still want to talk to me about it, which is nice. The book that I'm working on now is, and I've been working on it for a while, is focus on what I think of as these problems about like understanding who I will become, but understanding the relationship between these kinds of big life choices and how we persist through time as changing individuals, the nature of the kind of learning and revelation that I think is involved in undergoing transformation. And then ultimately also I kind of want to talk about, well, there are, I think, a number of interesting philosophical questions that kind of come up along the way as we have this kind of life's journey. So I think of the book as ultimately being like a mix of thinking about whether someone wants to become a vampire, exploring how this relates to time travel, and then bringing it all together with a consideration of like psychedelic experience.
Wow.
So because the thought is that like becoming a vampire, whether or not you wanted to do so or becoming a parent or whatever, involves this kind of major life reconfiguration and becoming a new kind of self. This is intimately related to how we understand ourselves as persisting through time, and time travel is basically all of like understanding the nature of and the possibility of time travel is just a way of persisting through time. Just maybe we can kind of jump in various ways from time to time instead of just persisting in this ordinary, boring way. I mean, that we normally travel in time is just like how we travel in a car or whatever, right? It's continuous and slow. And then the stuff about psychedelics, I'm really interested in the way that the mind meets the world and tries to make sense of the world and reconstructs its way of making sense of the world. And that's a kind of revelation. So
that sounds like a Hollywood pitch.
We're going to see how it goes. I mean, I have a book contract and everything, and my editor seems to like it. So, but it's taking me forever. So, well, I mean, the pandemic got in the way and, other things. And I could write it quickly and it wouldn't be what I want. So I'm just writing very slowly, but my editor seems to be very patient. So I'm okay.
I really appreciate you making time for us today here at Jung in the World. And I look forward to following more of your work, Lori Paul, because I think, first of all, I've just been fascinated with how some of the greatest thinkers right now are coming out of philosophy departments. Like that wasn't a thing 25 years ago, So before I let you go, that has been a burning question for me. Like, what's up? What's going on in the realm of philosophy that it has gotten so hot?
It's super interesting that you've noticed this. I mean, I think for a while, philosophy kind of turned inward in a way that involved kind of refining some tools very well, but also like kind of disconnected it from larger questions in the outside world. And that was a dissatisfying place to be for a lot of people. And there was another kind of impact in which we noticed that students were not responding to some of the kinds of ways that philosophers were trying to interact with them. And there was this sort of learning curve where people were realizing, look, there are really interesting questions here that we need to engage with and that we need to talk about, and we should do it. And so I think people have been trying to get both to think more broadly and apply philosophical kinds of tools and thoughts to kinds of larger questions, and then also just to kind of make the effort to have conversations with people. And then the world has also responded in this wonderful way. I think like maybe 10 or 50 years ago or 20 years ago, people maybe weren't so interested in what philosophers had to say. But now with all the transformation, all the change, it becomes clear that actually there are abstract questions that we have to consider. Life is not just kind of plodding along in some straightforward way, and there are no, and the straightforward answers we thought we had are not available. And so that's kind of when you need a philosopher, because we're the weirdos over here asking the weird questions, and it's what we do for a living.
Right. Even as that middle school girl.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Believe me, all the kids knew I was weird.
Well, thanks for being weird with us today. That was really a pleasure. Thank you, Lori Paul.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like more information about training programs, live and self-study courses, archives, this podcast, our blog, or to find Jungian analysts near you, visit our website, jungchicago.org. Thank you to our 2023 donors who gave at the contributor level or above: Barbara Anand, Uni Alcott, April Barrett, Arlo Compan, Judith Cooper, Lorna Crowell, David Dalrymple, Kevin Davis, Dr. Peter DeMuth, Mary Doherty, Christine Foskett, Britta W. Jacobson, Mary Ann Johnson, Mary W. Liebman, Mona Manning, Patricia Martin, Boris Matthews, Kenan McKee, Sue Rosenthal, David O. Stats, Lawrence C. Tingley, Don Troyer, Robert Ulrich, Alexander Wayne and Lynn Kopp, Gerald Weiner, William Wolfe, and Ellen Young. You can support this podcast by making a donation at our website, jungchicago.org.